Hi everyone, this is May and welcome back to DK Mentoring Newsletter Interview. So this is the interview section number 3, and in the previous two sections, we talk about Dean Stanton Worsum's new book, Migration Narratives. Today, we will continue to talk about the book, the immigrants, and interethnic relationships.
And also, we can see that when immigrants they're coming into the U.S., they are kind of interacting with a lot of different ethnic groups. And how do you think that kind of interethnic relationships will affect like the futures of the immigration groups?
It's definitely true that America is a complicated country. It's a heterogeneous country. There are people from many backgrounds. And so in this town that we worked in, the people who founded the town about 200 years ago were largely English. So they were largely people who had immigrated or whose ancestors had immigrated from England. And that meant that they were Protestant. And it meant that they were coming from a particular Anglo-Saxon background. There were also some Dutch people, a few Germans, so some other Northern European people who were there at the beginning. Then, maybe 20, 30 years after the founding of the town, the Irish started to come. And so there were large numbers of Irish people who arrived in this particular town. And they were initially brought to work on railroads. So the railroads were being built at the time. So the Irish worked on the railroads and other large projects. So Irish people moved in, and the Irish people and the English people did not get along. The English were Protestant, the Irish were Catholic. The English had very clear prejudices about the Irish, that they were drunk and violent and unintelligent and all sorts of horrible theories. And so there was interethnic tension between the Irish and the English. And over time, the Irish became a dominant group in town. There were more and more Irish people. The Catholic churches became the main churches in town. The politicians started to be Irish. So by the end of the 19th century, all of a sudden you had a town that was dominated by Irish people. You know, the main cemetery in town was run by the Catholic Church. The main politicians in town were Irish politicians. Most of the business owners were Irish business owners and the landlords. And then the Italians started coming. And so Italians started coming around 1900. And the Italians were Catholic like the Irish, but the Irish didn't like them. And so the Irish treated them as if there was something wrong with them. People from Southern Europe were considered less educated, more violent. And so the Irish tried to push the Italians into one side of town, the east side of town. And there were serious ethnic tensions. And 10 or 20 years after the Italians started coming, African Americans started coming from the South. So they had been former slaves in the southern states in the US. And there's something called the Great Migration, which started around 1910. But throughout the whole middle of the 20th century, there were Black people coming from the South for better economic opportunity up to the North. And so there were waves, thousands of Blacks who came to this town during that period. And initially they lived with the Italians in the same neighborhoods because the Irish wouldn't let the Blacks or the Italians into their side of town. So initially the Italians and the Blacks tended to live side by side, and by many accounts, they got along okay. But over time, the Italians moved forward, and the African Americans didn't do as well economically. And so over time, you started to get Italians dominating the town government, dominating the business district, being most of the landlords. There were some African Americans who succeeded economically. They often moved out of town. And many of the English and the Irish and the Italian and the Black people who were economically successful moved out of this town to more desirable towns nearby. And so when the Mexicans arrived, there's this very complicated set of people. You had some Northern European Protestants, English and others, who still lived there, their ancestors, not very many, but some. A lot of Irish who lived in town, whose ancestors had come from Ireland. Even more Italians or Italian Americans whose ancestors had come from Italy, and then a good chunk of African Americans. So by the time we left in 2016, the town was about 1/3 Mexican, 1/3 African American, and 1/3 European American of these different kinds, mostly Irish and Italian origin people, whose families had mostly been in the US for several generations by that point. And interethnic relations are critical because when the Mexicans started arriving, they had to deal with the fact that the town council and the school board were dominated by Italian Americans and African Americans. So those were the two groups that had power in terms of how do you run the schools and what are the regulations on businesses and what are the rules for parking and all sorts of other stuff was controlled by Black and Italian American people. And so the Mexicans have to work out, how are we going to relate to these dominant groups of people, and how are they thinking of us, and are they different? And they are different because the Italian Americans and the African Americans didn't always get along. There were some tensions between those two communities. And so the Mexicans had to figure out where do they position themselves, and different communities interpret the Mexicans differently. So it's a complicated set of at least three groups of people: Black, Mexican, and Irish or Italian. And those groups of people interacted in different ways. I can give you an example. So Mexicans, a lot of them are very entrepreneurial people. They started businesses. Usually they started restaurants or small grocery stores. And in those restaurants, most of the Irish and Italian American people interpreted that as revitalizing the town. So they felt it was good for the town that all of a sudden you had Mexican business owners opening up businesses on some of the downtown streets. They thought it was bringing the town back. It was, the town had gone downhill. There had been bad economic times. And now all of a sudden the Mexican businesses were bringing money back and bringing customers back downtown. And they saw that usually as a good thing. Whereas most African Americans didn't like it because before the Mexicans came, most of those stores downtown had been owned by Blacks. And the Blacks had been having something of a difficult time. Many of the businesses were struggling a little bit. But still, from the perspective of most Black residents, the town before the Mexicans came was a pretty good place. There were a lot of Black people who lived there. People were pretty friendly. It was relatively safe. There were some Black-owned businesses. There were challenges, but at the same time, it was not a bad place to live. And so a lot of the Black residents were not happy to see Mexicans showing up and replacing a Black-owned business with a Mexican-owned business. And so you have this divergence of opinions. The Italians and Irish see the Mexicans as a good thing, a revitalizing force. The Blacks see these new Mexican businesses as not a good thing, as a force that indicates the decline or the end of their own community there. And so the relations between these groups are complicated, and it's not even clear today how it's going to work out. Could be that the Mexicans are going to see themselves as just like Italians, where they're going to end up being more and more successful. They're going to become business owners and landlords. And one Italian guy told us, in 25 years, Mexicans are going to be running this town. You know, they'll be just like me and my other Italian compatriots. So that's possible. But on the other hand, there are some organizations in which Black residents and Mexican residents get together and they form groups that try to oppose racism. They schedule demonstrations and they try to educate young people about the evils of racism and how to overcome it. And so another possibility is that the Mexicans sort of build solidarity with a lot of Blacks and they engage in some efforts for social change, like the Black Lives Matter movement and other things. So it's not clear how we're going to see the relations between these different groups happen, but it's clear that that's a crucial aspect of the experience of an immigrant group, is how do they get along with other kinds of groups.
Thank you, Dean Wortham, and thanks everyone for watching our interview. If you're interested in the book Migration Narratives, please download a free copy using the link below. We have just one more topic to discuss in this series and hope to see you all in the final episode. Have a great day.